The Mongol way of war wasn't just fast, it was systemic. In 1223, by the banks of the Kalka River, the Steppe Empire revealed not just a tactic, but a worldview. Mobility over mass, deception over display, unity over rivalry. On the other side, the Rus princes walked into that worldview and shattered. It was May. The Rus coalition, hastily assembled after pressure from fleeing Cuman allies, marched east with confidence. They numbered over 30,000, a patchwork of Slavic hosts and nomadic auxiliaries. The Mongols, under Subedei and Jebe, counted fewer, but they had something more powerful than men: coherence. Their army moved as one thought. The terrain at Kalka was deceptive, a wide river with few fords, open plains that lured cavalry into pursuit. Subedei chose his ground deliberately. He let the Rus believe he was retreating in panic. The Russians, eager to claim victory and unaware of Mongol operational depth, crossed the river in fragmented waves. No reconnaissance, no coordination. Here lies the first decision point. Some commanders urged caution, secure the flanks, wait for the rear. Others, driven by pride or rivalry, pushed ahead. They feared losing glory more than men. The result: a stretched formation, fragmented command, and a perfect kill zone. A pause is needed here. Kalka wasn't just a tactical failure. It was a structural exposure. The Rus lacked a unified command. Their princes were co-equals in name, but rivals in ambition. Each led his own troops, answered to no central strategy, and refused to yield authority. The Mongols, in contrast, had a single chain of command and used it with surgical precision. Once the vanguard crossed, the Mongol rearguard turned. The feigned retreat flipped into a pincer movement, a tactical maneuver to encircle the enemy from both sides. Panic spread fast. The river now became a wall behind the Rus. There was no fallback. According to Rus, this feigned retreat was the most refined use of Mongol military art, a psychological operation fused with terrain exploitation. Empire of the Steppes, 1970. Nicole adds that Kalka was not a battle. It was a trap. And in that trap, the fracture lines of Slavic politics snapped. What began as a pursuit ended in slaughter. What does this imply for the rest of the campaign? That Subedei wasn't just testing armies, he was testing civilizations. In the war councils before Kalka, the greatest threat wasn't Mongol steel, it was Russian pride. The princes of Kiev, Gallic, and Chernihiv shared a banner, but not a vision. Each one carried his own agenda, and none wanted to be second. A stylized image survives in chronicles. Nobles arguing under icons, voices rising over maps. It was here, not on the steppe, that the defeat began. The Cumans, recently defeated by the Mongols, had pleaded for help. Mstislav of Kiev responded, not out of strategic calculation, but to seize the initiative before his rivals did. This was the core dilemma. Should the coalition wait and coordinate at the risk of looking weak, or strike immediately and claim glory? Mstislav chose to move fast. Others, fearing the political cost of delay, followed. The coalition, a temporary alliance of parties with separate interests, became a race. And the Mongols? Subedei and Jebe, with fewer than 20,000 men, were counting on this. Their entire campaign west of the Volga was a probe, a long-range test of Europe's response capacity. Their conclusion: pride fractures coalitions. Pause for context. Mongol strategy wasn't just based on movement, it was based on behavior. Subedei understood the psychology of the enemy. He didn't just outmaneuver them, he made them choose self-sabotage. By feigning weakness, he provoked exactly the overreaction he needed. The Rus believed they had superior numbers, terrain advantage, and time. All three turned out to be illusions. Nicole notes, the Mongols lured their enemies not by strength, but by calculated vulnerability. Morgan adds, Subedei's brilliance lay in never needing to be stronger, only in making his enemies act weaker. That's the civilizational gap. In Kievan Rus, prestige often overrode prudence. In the Mongol Empire, Command was earned by loyalty and results. When one prince hesitated, the Mongols waited. When another rushed in, they retreated, inviting disarray. The result? Each contingent crossed rivers, marched for days, and deployed independently. The cohesion of the force was an illusion. The battle would expose it. And the consequence was clear. Kalka wasn't just a tactical loss. It was a moral collapse, preordained by the very structure of the coalition, a structure the Mongols knew how to exploit. The Kalka campaign didn't begin with unity. It began with desperation. In early 1223, the Kuman Khans fled across the steppes, shattered by the Mongols. They reached the Rus principalities not as emissaries of strategy, but as refugees of defeat. Here lies the first dilemma. Should the Rus form an immediate alliance, risking trust in a defeated ally, or fight alone and risk being outnumbered? They chose the first, but in haste. The Kuman emissaries warned of a deadly enemy, unlike anything the steppe had seen. But they offered little more than urgency. Their forces were depleted, their loyalty uncertain. Still, the Rus saw advantage, a common enemy, a way to rally prestige, and a pretext for war. What they lacked was coordination. Pause to examine the coalition. It wasn't forged in policy, it was patched together on the march. Different languages, command styles, and expectations. No joint supply lines. No unified strategy. Nicole writes, "This was less an alliance and more a convergence of fear. That fear led to logistical overreach. Some Rus contingents marched over 600 kilometers to join the host. Without proper staging, they relied on local forage lines, extended supply routes used for feeding horses and troops." Rus notes that the Kalka campaign strained the fragile logistical limits of feudal armies. Meanwhile, the Mongols used diplomacy like arrows, precise, selective. Subedei sent different messages to different tribes. To some Kumans, promises of peace. To others, threats of annihilation. This fractured the enemy before contact. Chambers observes, Subedei wielded diplomacy as a scalpel, not to heal, but to divide. Here's the civilizational contrast again. The Mongols, even on foreign soil, maintained a unified command and strategic discipline. The Rus-Kuman alliance, built on mutual fear rather than structure, began to dissolve the moment it formed. This explains the campaign's fragility. When pressure mounted, the coalition didn't consolidate, it splintered. The Kumans, sensing risk, fought defensively. The Rus, driven by pride and distance, pushed forward recklessly. And as the Mongols retreated westward, drawing their enemies into deeper terrain, one question loomed. Could this patchwork force survive a coordinated blow? By the time the coalition realized the trap, it was too late. The Mongols had led them deep into terrain shaped for collapse. Open flanks, low hills for cover, and a river at their backs. The geography became the noose, and Subedei pulled tight. The Rus troops advanced in depth, long, thin columns with exposed flanks. They sought contact, believing the enemy was retreating. But the Mongols didn't flee. They shifted. Light cavalry peeled off, circling around to the sides and rear, tightening the encirclement, surrounding an enemy to prevent escape or reinforcement. Pause for visual clarity. Imagine a shallow valley with a river at the rear. The Rus move forward into it, chasing what they think is a retreating foe. Then, from the hills, Mongol units descend. The retreat had been a feint. Now it was a clamp. Rus notes, the maneuver resembled a classic steppe pinka, not brute force, but a trap of fluid geometry. The Rus command tried to adapt. Scouts were sent, messages issued, but the chain of command was brittle. Each prince still controlled his own banner. Orders conflicted. Panic set in. Instead of consolidating, the coalition tried to push forward, deeper into the kill zone. Subedei's forces opened a deliberate gap on one side, inviting a desperate thrust, then slammed shut with fresh riders. The coalition fractured. Some units held ground. Others broke ranks. Coordination dissolved under pressure. Morgan writes, The Mongol strength was not just mobility, it was orchestration. They conducted battles like siege engines conduct stone. One Russian contingent tried to withdraw to a nearby hilltop, but the Mongols had already sealed the exits. The river that once served as a route of approach now blocked retreat. The terrain that promised speed now demanded sacrifice. Here's the strategic insight. The Mongols used the coalition's own structure against it. Fragmented command, ego-led decisions, and haste all became liabilities under pressure. And so, the pincer closed not with a clash, but a suffocation. A battle without a center. A campaign without a second chance. What does this imply for the chapters ahead? That collapse wasn't a single moment. It was a system unraveling, and the Mongols understood that better than anyone. What breaks an army isn't always the sword. At Kalka, it was the mind, and the fracture line started with the Cumans. They were the first to flee. Lightly equipped, already weary from prior defeats, their role had never been firmly defined. When Mongol pressure increased, they saw the writing on the steppe and left. Their flight cracked the coalition from within. This is the essence of a panic rout, sudden mass flight by a disorganized force. The Rus troops saw allies breaking and assumed the worst. Messages from the front became incoherent. Commands clashed. The illusion of coordination vanished. Pause here. Military coalitions often fail not from combat, but from fear contagion. Morgan writes, Kalka was a psychological unraveling. Not merely defeat, but disintegration under pressure. For 3 days, a fragment of the Rus force, led by Mstislav of Kiev, held out on the riverbank, encircled. They built a defensive position with wagons and waited. No help came. No relief was possible. The Mongols, patient and calculating, starved them out. The trauma deepened. Survivors reported that men drank horse blood to stay alive. Nicole describes it as a siege not of walls, but of wills. Eventually, Mstislav sought negotiation. He offered surrender in exchange for safe passage. The Mongols agreed, and then executed the nobles. Subedei sent a message not just to the Rus, but to all Europe. Trust is a weapon, too. This was a decision moment. Resist and risk destruction, or negotiate and risk betrayal. Both options led to annihilation, but the Mongols let their enemy choose. And this, too, reflects a civilizational divide, where the Rus saw honor in terms of ritual and agreement. The Mongols saw it as subordinate to victory. They did not share the same rules of war. By the end, the coalition had ceased to exist. Its parts had fled, been absorbed, or died. What remained was memory, bitter, splintered, and unresolved. The consequences were more than tactical. Kalka showed that under stress, a force without cohesion collapses from within. That fear spreads faster than messengers. And that in war, sometimes the most decisive blow is the one you let your enemy deliver to himself. When the dust settled over the Kalka River, the Mongols didn't press forward. They turned back east. To the Rus, this looked like a retreat. But to Subedei, it was a note in a longer score, a rehearsal, not the performance. Grusset observes, the Mongols were not repelled, they paused. Kalka was not a culmination, but a calibration. This is where the civilizational divide resurfaces. The Rus interpreted the Mongol withdrawal as a reprieve. In truth, it was a record. The Mongols cataloged the rivers, the routes, the weaknesses. They took captives not for labor, but for intelligence. And yet, despite the trauma, the Rus changed little. Political rivalry continued. The same princes who had ignored coordination in 1223 resumed their local feuds by 1224. No reforms, no strategic integration, no centralized command. The precedent was ignored. This was a decision moment. Learn from collapse at the cost of internal tension, or return to business as usual. They chose the latter. Morgan notes, there was no mobilization of lessons, no strategic synthesis. Only memory, and not all memory is action. Meanwhile, Subedei and the Mongol general staff used Kalka for what it was, a prototype. The next time they returned, in 1237, they wouldn't probe. They'd invade. Pause for comparison. The 1223 route became the spine of the 1237 campaign. Same rivers, same gaps in coordination, same blind spots in reconnaissance. Only now, the Mongols brought siege engines, strategic depth, and orders from Batu, Genghis Khan's grandson, to occupy, not test. What was the strategic logic of withdrawing after total victory? Nicole explains. The Mongols needed nothing more from Kalka. They had measured Europe's armor and found it hollow. So why didn't they press into Rus in 1223? Because they didn't need to. Civilization ally. Their enemy had already exposed himself. The Mongols were not opportunistic raiders. They were systemic planners. The Rus had a chance to restructure after Kalka. They had data, memory, and even surviving commanders. But they lacked political will. The precedent was written, but unread. And so, the deeper question lingers. Can a civilization survive the same mistake twice? The battle was over, but the damage had just begun. Kalka didn't only end in death, it echoed in memory. Across the Rus lands, silence filled the gaps where warriors had once stood. And where words returned, they came as chronicles. The tale of Kalka spread not just through soldiers, but through survivors. Monks, scribes, and chroniclers turned the disaster into scripture. They told of betrayal, of mass graves, of princes executed under boards to avoid spilling noble blood. Memory became martyrdom. Morgan calls it a cultural trauma, collective psychological damage transmitted across generations. And it wasn't healing. It hardened. The Rus principalities didn't unite in response. They blamed. Chronicles from Novgorod accused Mstislav of Gallic. Others in Kiev pointed to Cuman treachery. Instead of closure, Kalka deepened rivalries. This was the core dilemma. Could the memory of Kalka be transformed into political unity? Or would it calcify into permanent fragmentation? Chambers notes, the Mongols knew what they left behind wasn't just ruin. It was a divided memory, an enemy turned inward. Fear, too, played its part. Across the steppe, whispers of the Mongols became warnings. Cities prepared walls. Families buried valuables. But there was no coordinated defense, only localized panic. Terror became a policy, and the Mongols didn't even need to be present to enforce it. Pause here. The aftermath of Kalka shows how psychological warfare can persist long after the last arrow. The Mongols understood this. They didn't just destroy armies, they left ghosts. Even the decision to surrender and the brutal betrayal that followed took on symbolic weight. It taught future leaders not just to fear the Mongols, but to distrust diplomacy itself. By the time Subedei returned in 1237, the memory of Kalka had not unified the Rus. It had isolated them further. The long-term implication is stark. Kalka was not a single defeat. It became a generational fracture. Its trauma echoed in policy, in memory, and in silence. And the deeper question for any civilization is this. When defeat becomes identity, how do you survive what you've already remembered?